Welcome to Fish and Rice, Stories from Japan. I'm Toby.
I'm Andre.
And today we welcome Asa on the show.
Thanks for having me, gentlemen. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for coming. You are the founder and CEO of Skyscape, a company that is working in the field of, to put it simple, flying cars. But we're going to get into that in more detail and explain what you're actually doing with this. And before we get to that, maybe you could introduce yourself a little bit to our listeners.
Yeah, of course. Everyone, thank you again for having me. Fish and Rice Podcast. Appreciate it, guys. I've known Toby for quite a little bit now, local Osaka. But Asa Questenberry, simply as put, founder, president of Skyscape Kabushi Gaisha. So for those who aren't familiar, Kabushi Gaisha, corporation here in Japan. We got the company founded about, I think we're in our 4th year, so 3.5 years of business, something like that. Toby here met me, years ago, right when we were just getting started. Yeah, just getting started with that. Been in Japan 5 years, I would say, just about 5 years this summer. Coming from the US, I bounced around a lot of places in the US. I was in Canada, actually, before I came out here to Japan. And came here for a very short trip that has now turned into many years, business, community, friends, and lots of other wonderful stuff. So thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, what made you decide to come to Japan? You were like in nice Canada and like a beautiful landscape, scenery.
Vancouver is expensive.
Yeah.
No. I was in the US. I was working in Canada for a couple of reasons, and ended up back in the US. Was kind of just figuring out what I wanted to do. Was still relatively young at the time. I don't know. There wasn't like a I have to go to Japan for this or something. I think it was more so just realizing the age I was about 23 when I decided to come out here, and was like, if I'm going to do something crazy like move to the other side of the world, now's the time to do it. You mix in a lot of other political craziness in the US at the time. I just wanted like a 6-month break essentially, and I had studied a semester or so of Japanese when I was a university student. So I was like, okay, we'll do Japan for 6 months, and came here to Osaka. I guess like my story a little differently. I'm not sure, maybe it's the same for you, but like never lived out in Tokyo. Been based in Osaka, Kansai since came here to Japan, which I don't think is typically the norm, or maybe getting a little different these days. But yeah, so no real reason in particular, I would say.
And then Osaka was just like threw the dart on the map and like landed
Osaka,
right here in Kansai.
Osaka was central, right? So like, sure. I think I looked at like the Tokyo subway map, and I was like, no,
too much.
It's not happening. No, actually, I had a friend that had visited out here, and he had given me a little insight where he was saying like, Tokyo is great and whatever. You can argue like the price of living and whatnot is a tragedy in itself, but he was saying that a lot of times with foreigners in Tokyo is because there's so many foreigners in Tokyo and it's so English accessible, you get into these like bubbles where like you aren't learning the culture, you aren't learning the language, you aren't meeting like, not to say you need to meet Japanese people, but you aren't getting those local connections, or it's easier to fall into tendencies where you only, because people associate with what they know, right? So you're only, next thing you know, you've been there a year and a half, you're only associating with other foreigners, you're not speaking any Japanese. So that was just like an intro from a friend, and I knew I didn't want that. So I was like, okay, I want something a little different. I don't want to be out in the boonies. I want to be somewhere a little bit centrally located, but not that experience in Tokyo. So Osaka, I heard the food was good. It was centrally located. So I was like, sure, let's make it happen. And very good decision.
What was it like when you arrived? Like any challenges where you were like, oh, did I make the right choice to actually move to Japan from the US?
Oh man, there's a couple ways you can come here, but like relatively speaking, teaching and teaching, I'm not to talk negatively about teaching. Teaching for me, why I started a business was because teaching just it had a ceiling on the type of lifestyle that I wanted to live, that I wasn't going to achieve in the teaching lifestyle. But I didn't really have any regrets, simply because teaching was so flexible when I came out here. My job was to talk to people basically for work, right? And I had enough money to cover the bills. I was, meeting people, could go out and enjoy the nightlife. So it was more so, festivities, I would say, for the first 6 months, which again, got 6 months in, I was like, oh man, well now I'm just starting to get the hang of this. Okay, I'll do another 6 months. And then that turned into another year, and then blah, 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 right?
And then came a point where you're like, okay, if I'm staying here, I'm not going to continue the path of the teacher. I'm going to do something else.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is, and I think anyone who's lived abroad, you can attest to this a little bit, but I was lucky enough that a coworker actually explained the idea of the Gaijin trap. right?
Okay, can you enlighten us?
Right, so essentially, and this can apply to any country that has lots of expats moving there, especially if teaching is like a high reason for them moving there. You move to a country, your teaching job is exactly like I said. You pay your bills, you can go out and enjoy yourself. You're not saving a lot of money, but you're relatively taken care of. But the downside being you're not speaking the local language, right? So, okay, you do that for a year, you decide to stay, okay, you do it for a second year. Typically in that window, you meet your spouse, right? If you get into a serious relationship, especially if it's with a local, resident or, a native, whatever country you're at, they end up being the language gap or the language bridge for you in a lot of situations. So then, okay, that's great. And then you hit the 3-year mark, and then suddenly you're in a situation where you really have to make a choice, because if you continue past that point, that 3-year mark typically, you really run the risk of like a negative situation essentially occurring, which is known here as the Gaijin trap, right? Where essentially, okay, you've stayed past 3 years, you're still teaching, but now you can't go back to wherever you're from because your resume is atrocious, right? You're going back to your country and they're like, what have you been doing for 4 years? And it's like, I've been speaking English. And it's like, okay, well, that kid programs Python and also speaks English and a couple other languages, right? So your resume is really, really bad. You come to realize that after 3 or 4 years, there's very little upward
mobility
career in the teaching kind of space. I mean, you can get into universities and whatnot, but it's less common than it was in the 90s or 80s, right? So you got poor career mobility. You've got, you can't go back to your country, and then you're hyper dependent on your spouse to handle like all of your adult situations, going to the bank, going to the ward office, taking care of your medical bills.
Unless you learn Japanese.
But that's the catch-22 is typically at these teaching jobs, you're not allowed to speak Japanese, right?
It makes it hard to practice.
Exactly. And also you work anything 9 hours a day. You don't want to go home and then break out the textbooks to study, right?
So you heard of that and you're like, I don't want to fall into this.
Man, yes. Thank you, Raphael. Wherever you're out there, man. Thank you, Raphael. You definitely set me on a proper trajectory.
So what made you decide, like, okay, instead of applying for another job in another company, doing something that you might be qualified at based on your maybe university background, you decided, I'm going to start a company flying drones around Japan?
Right. So again, now here's the other side of teaching was hyper flexible, right? If you're good at especially if you're good at what you do, right? If you are good at teaching, the students are comfortable, those companies want to keep you because there's lots of people that want to come to countries and teach English, let's just say there's a large variance in the
there's a difference between teachers that want to teach and are trained teachers
or good at it, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of times being trained doesn't help you. A lot of it is like, can you talk to people, right? Can you make a strange, especially in like the Eikaiwa or the English, what's the translation?
Communication school?
English communication school, right? It's communication schools.
Yeah.
They want to come in and talk to someone in English. So it's like if you're like socially inept and you can't, create conversation with someone, it doesn't matter if you have a doctorate in English and grammar, you're not a good teacher, so to speak. So anyway, the question was why start a company? Well, with the flexibility of those jobs, of the teaching jobs, it was one of the benefits was I was able to slowly on the side start working and start putting together a plan or an idea of what I wanted to do with the business. So I basically just did what I did in the US and Canada.
So you worked with drones before?
Yeah, so my background is architecture, urban planning, which is what I studied, a little bit of sustainable systems in there. And then just by chance, as I was graduating, I got an internship for a drone company. So essentially what we were doing is we were taking drones to inspect like canals and infrastructure and agricultural fields, just collecting data.
So to give some context, when people imagine drones now, they might be thinking of to not name brands, maybe the typical video camera attached drone to take photos.
Yep.
But the drones you're talking about that you were flying, they are like huge machines that have
huge mix, right? I mean, you could get anything from like really big agricultural like crop spraying drones down to like, again, without any brands, little tiny camera ones.
Yeah.
Right. Drones are just tools to put sensors in locations cheaper, right? Whether that sensor is a camera or a photovoltaic responder camera, PV camera, thermal camera, whatever it might be.
So you scan the floor with this and you get the data for whomever needs it.
Scan the floor, scan the crops, scan the canal, take pictures, videos, collect reflections of stuff. So I was doing that before. That led into what I was doing in Canada as well. I worked at another company up in Canada and did that. And then to me, that was just a logical choice of what I wanted to do. A lot of it was just me being really naive and not understanding like what it actually meant to go through that process out here. But also I had tons of equipment. Like I had all this equipment that I had built up, you know, and the university in like my early career. That was like, I just wasn't doing anything with it. I was like, well, if I'm going to have it, you know, that's already part of the startup cost that's taken care of. So I was able to work, you know, still work my day job. And then on the side was able to build up kind of the plan for the exit, so to speak.
So your exit at that time, you called it DroneX.
DroneX.
Before it became Skyscape.
Yes.
So
informed. Yes.
DroneX was a company, correct me if I'm wrong, where you offered those services you just mentioned to local governments in Japan or local communities or even private companies to go scan, for example, a mountain range for risks of mudslides.
Exactly. Yeah, that was one of the projects we did. Wow, you did your research.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
So how did that work? How was it?
So this is a standard business model in the space. It's called a drone service provider, or DSP. It's typically with the drone work, it's like you're either collecting the data or you're processing the data. So I'm not a programmer or an engineer. I just know how to fly drones around and capture the data properly. So you've got so we really dialed in on, we did a lot of early stuff with kind of terrain mapping with landslide response and things like that, or landslide education for the communities. But we eventually zeroed in on clean energy services. So we would do solar farm inspections and wind turbine inspections. And occasionally we would do some infrastructure, whether like apartments or bridges we would look at. But that's what we were doing in the beginning. So very simple. Again, you got a big solar field and you need to figure out where are the tiny damages on a massive solar farm, right? You can fly a drone with a thermal camera across the top of it in a grid pattern, and you can find out in a day as compared to weeks of man hours otherwise. So we would just capture the data, plug in the SD card to the program or the computer, send it away to the processors. They would process it and then deliver it to the end client, which would be a construction group, an energy group, the asset owner, whoever really.
This might be a little bit of a naive question perhaps, but everywhere you go in Japan, you see no fly drone signs.
No drone zone.
No drone zone.
No drone zone. Yes.
Everywhere.
Everywhere the no drone zones.
So what is actually the regulation here in Japan to fly those?
Yeah. So in Japan, we have what's called DID zones. I don't know how I think it's called DID. Stands for Densely Inhabited District. So don't quote me on this, but to my knowledge, it's more than 4,000 residents within 1 square kilometer, which, spoiler alert, that's
most of Japan.
Any city in Japan is more dense than that. So there's really very, very limited areas for you to fly recreationally at a hobbyist level. So my company, one of the original paths we had to take as an operator, commercial operator, is we had to get permissions from the government to allow us to fly our equipment. So you still had to apply, especially in some certain areas, on a per project basis. But we were essentially approved and still are approved to fly anywhere in the country. I've flown downtown Ginza in Tokyo. I've flown countryside locations. I've flown near airports safely. We worked with the airport, right? But so we just had to go through the regulatory process to get the approvals and the permissions to fly. But for hobby level people, if you come to Japan, don't fly without your permissions, because I think it's a $5,000 fine, Gojuman gurai, just to start with that. So
is it a license you need, or just you need to apply for local government permission, or police office, let them know, oh, I'm gonna fly a drone in this zone, is that okay? And that's enough.
It's moving towards a licensing system, which is good. When I came here, it was there was licenses, but it was Takeshi-san's little drone school and Hiroki-san's little drone school, and you could go there and they'd teach you how to fly a drone and whatnot, and they'd give you a license, so to speak, but permissions-wise, it had no legal bearing more than anything else, right? So what you had to do is you had to apply with the MLIT, which is the ministry that's responsible for infrastructure, transportation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You have to register the company, you have to register the pilot, and then you have to register each individual piece of equipment to said pilot. So once you get all your paperwork in straight, technically speaking, you can fly anywhere.
Okay.
In good faith, we've done jobs. I think one time we were flying not at Osaka Castle, but near Osaka Castle, and it resulted in 4 police officers showing up and then detectives showing up, because I guess there turned out there was an embassy in the area. So they saw 10 foreigners outside with drones and cameras near an embassy, and So We learned very quickly that in good faith, you should at least talk to the police department prior. Technically speaking, you don't need to, but in the terms of, proper
Might
flight
save you
planning,
some trouble.
Yeah, it also they like you a lot more if you kind of take that approach. So no licenses, but just permissions.
So how was how were these first few years with your DroneX company, where you essentially worked most of the time by yourself because you were qualified to fly those drones and you were going around the country?
I mean, first ups and downs. I think any startup. I mean, I registered the company. We probably took that period of working at the teaching job while doing this on the side was probably about 8 or 9 months. And then by the time I could quit that and go full time, we started April 7th and the country went into COVID lockdown April 22nd.
It's good timing.
Yeah. So ironically though, that was a good thing because, for example, we had a couple of our first projects where companies that had projects in Japan, they were going to come do some inspection or something, but then they couldn't come into the country. So then we spoke English, which was a huge benefit, even compared to like a lot of domestic competition at the time where they were just dependent on the Japanese market. But I'm like, through my past work and through what we do on LinkedIn, we're connected with people all over the world. So we were getting projects from the international market, whereas we weren't getting a lot of stuff from the domestic market because, Nihonjin Janai, and there's challenges with that. So yeah, I think the first couple of years had lots of ups and downs, but then it became very clear with like the progression of AI, the autonomous nature of a lot of these flights that more and more the pilot was not needed, and that the future of this was going to be fully automated. At the same time, you had a huge inbound push from large domestic Japanese corporations, like talking, again, not to name any groups, massive conglomerates, like the major telecom company. So a good example of why this became a challenge. In the US, telecom towers are a major source of like bread and butter drone operator jobs, right? You go out, you fly it, it's relatively easy work, it pays really, really well, and you can do it consistently, right? But in Japan, the major telecoms are operated by like one company. And instead of hiring out, operators in small companies to do that company's like, we're just gonna do it ourselves.
Yeah.
And then expanded from that. So they're getting all the work from themselves, and then they're expanding in other industries. So at the end of the day, I think we just got the most challenging point was essentially having to make a pivot, which is what led us to become Skyscape and focusing on something a little bit different than the drone space, just because we were at a massive disadvantage when it came to like drones, especially here domestically.
So you had the first few years where you established yourself a little bit. You went through the first challenges of getting incorporated and getting your first few clients. COVID was a good help for that. But then you realized that just you going through the country doing this job is not going to be something you're going to be able to do or continue doing for the next few years. How did you find your pivot and where did you pivot to?
I knew where it was, but it was just, I remember like bringing in like, cause we had a little bit of investors in the beginning, mostly friends and family and stuff like that. So we pivoted to, as you joked before, flying cars. Not necessarily flying cars, but essentially, so like I said, background's architecture and urban planning. I come from construction development world. And then after university and then my professional career, the early days was, I'll say aviation light. Like I'm not going to call myself an aviator because I fly drones. There's people that are like, I'm a pilot. I'm like, you use a remote control. But anyway, but I had an intro into aviation. I understood air traffic systems. I understood, the process of working with those ATCs. I understood, what it was like to be in the sphere without necessarily being a pilot. So the point of those two things connecting was this growing field called vertiports or vertiport development. So vertical heliport, essentially the idea being that really within the last 15 years, you've had crazy development in aviation. You've had the rise of drone systems. You've had the rise of AI with traffic management systems. You've had, essentially people are saying, let's take a drone, a helicopter, and a plane and just smash them together and see what we get. And the result is like at current, like more than 700 different experimental aircraft are currently being tested. Everything from fully electric to hybrid to hydrogen to sustainable aviation fuel versions of it, with the idea being that carbon emissions wise, aviation is like 3% of the global carbon emissions, right? So there's a huge push to
sustainability,
these new aircraft. So we said, okay, and I had known about this since university, tons of companies. And the challenge being that there was nowhere for them to land. So if you've got 700 different types of trains, but you don't have any rails,
they're useless.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't matter. So that was the perfect application I had felt for my own background, which was urban planning, architecture, and then aviation light, so to speak. So I remember and this is at a time where oh man, it was crazy, but it was just ridiculous in hindsight. Where it's I was hungry. I remember being a year and a half in. COVID is there was one point in the beginning of COVID where this is 3 months from now we're gonna be able to.
Everyone thought that. I think.
Oh man, but there's I think it's a year and a half in. We're this is never gonna end. I'm never gonna be able to leave the country. People are never coming back to Japan. It's gonna be ridiculous. And I was just onigiri, full on founder lifestyle, no food, working all the time, hungry. And I remember bringing in my business partner. We're meeting at a cafe, and where we would meet all the time because we couldn't work at an office. We didn't have money for it. And he's he was coming to that meeting to tell me he was quitting. And I came to that meeting, we sat down, and I was before you say anything, we got to do flying cars. And he was just
what are you talking about?
yeah. This is after a year and a half of just struggling with the drone stuff. I mean, we were making enough for sure. I mean, without being able to speak Japanese and being a group of one or two, we had another founder pass away. I mean, it was a crazy time that first year, right? So I come in and I'm we're gonna do flying cars. And I'll never forget the look on his face where he was just so absolutely probably just so sick of my entire craziness of the story of this, what we were gonna do. And sure enough, it was the best decision we ever made by far, with that not even close.
Yeah. So essentially, I mean, you had this moment where you looked at the market and you put all the pieces of the puzzle together and you saw a gap and you're I'm gonna fill that gap for Japan, which is I'm gonna build those basically the infrastructure for those flying cars.
Yep.
So we used the term flying cars so far, and we talked about, you mentioned a mix of drones, helicopters, planes, and so on. How, if someone is now not familiar with this, how would we define this, or what kind of image can we give of a flying car? Because maybe people think back of the Back to the Future, or just a car taking off.
So they're not cars at all. They're basically passenger drones is the easiest way. Essentially, drone tech has gotten to the point where maybe we can carry a person, right? And we can, and there's plenty of options out there for it. But the technical term is called eVTOL. So eVTOL, so electric vertical takeoff landing aircraft. Air taxi or flying car is much easier to say.
Yeah, it makes good in the media, right?
Oh, yeah. And you hear flying car, and every guy in the age of 6 to 65 is I'm down. This sounds great, right? Full on Jetsons. But the eVTOLs, I mean, are we allowed to say brands?
Yeah, of course.
On here. So where this all technically started off from, there's a couple different people. There's Dr. Wang in Singapore, who was one of the people that I had the pleasure of meeting in Singapore last week at an event. He was one of the original ones that coined eVTOL back maybe 15 or so years ago. But you had his work. You had a group in Germany called Volocopter, a lot of work they did, which was basically just a giant multi-propeller drone that they put a chair underneath.
Okay.
Scaled.
Volocopter makes sense.
Volocopter, exactly. And the other one is actually Uber, which was interesting.
The car service company.
Exactly. Uber. So Uber, their whole master plan was, what do you think is the biggest cost for Uber in terms of their P&L?
Traffic jams
or staff.
Yeah,
staff, right? They don't want to have drivers. That was great to start, but reality, they want no drivers. They want fully autonomous. I've never worked at Uber. I don't know Uber, what I've heard, right? They want fully autonomous operations and rides, because they lose so much of their, overhead is on staff. And then also traffic. Yeah, they wanted to do faster. So Uber commissioned this. They revealed this secret plan called Uber Air, right? And Uber Air was really, I would say, the inflection point where now suddenly, people had done, Dr. Wang had done research about this and whatnot. But this is like a massive, unicorn startup, darling media child being like, air taxis, we're going to do them. So their whole plan was they're going to build a number of infrastructure locations within a city, as well as an on-demand feature where you press a button and an air taxi will land at your location and it'll take you to where they want to go. Three main people wrote, that white paper, one of them being a gentleman called Mark Moore, who is, famously known in the industry, really, really great source. And then eventually they sold the idea, right? It turns out much harder than they had expected. Who would have thought? So Uber Air was sold and bought by a group that eventually became Joby, Joby. And Joby is now by far the world leader in this space. You've got Volocopter, Joby, a group called Archer. I can go on and on list of what.
So they're building the actual
air taxi.
eVTOLs, air taxis.
Yes. And the range of these, man, I wish I could tell you like there was one type, but there's so many. Like you've got types that just have propellers on top like a drone. You've got ones that have just fixed wings. You have ones that have wings that tilt and spin. If you like aviation or you're thinking about aviation, now is a very interesting time to get involved in this space.
So, and as you mentioned, one of the key things that they all need is basically places to land and start and take and pick up the passengers, right?
Yes, essentially.
So that's a big change for you in terms of a company as well. You go from flying drones around Japan to gather data to essentially becoming an infrastructure company. But building infrastructure, you need a lot of money. How do you go from the little startup to having an idea and getting people on board to be like, we can actually do this here in Japan if you invest in us?
I tell you what, man, I mean, dumb luck and perseverance can take you a long way. Obviously, we had a little bit of a strategy more than that, but a lot of it was timing. Timing really was an interesting aspect. So for example, about maybe I would say 2 months after I made this pivot, the Japanese government announced that with the Osaka Expo in 2025, the World Expo, they were going to debut air taxi services as a key feature of the Expo at the 2025
That's
Expo,
really good timing.
right?
Huh?
And all of the focus and development of the Japan air taxi industry would be here in Osaka because of the Expo. So we're like, oh, wow, lucked into that. So you had timing where the government got on board, startups were interested. It had been in the global space for like getting close to 10 years. I mean, a lot of that work with Uber Air and Volocopter, that's like from 2013 on, right?
It's a long time in the making. Huh?
For a startup, that's a decent amount of time, right? So it wasn't like as for people that were in the know, for people that were in that space and that were in the industry and were actually seriously looking at that, it wasn't as far-fetched as people that have no idea about aviation would even today would even imagine. But the pivot, man, I mean, and how do you go about that? I think especially in Japan, it's about showing like continuity and like cohesion in an idea. Like if you switch from like I'm building chairs and now I'm building flying cars, you're not going to get anywhere. But the fact that like, so people think, well, how does drones connect it? Well, it's aviation. At the end of the day, we're learning, interacting with, engaging with the aviation ecosystem. Even if it's just understanding the Civil Aviation Bureau and their regulations towards drones and operations of those, we're still within that sphere. So essentially the idea was, and we still continue those drone services now, albeit, there's a less strong of a push for them, is we were building our knowledge base, right? And again, I come from a background of you have to get the full picture. Aviation is so deep that like just approaching it from infrastructure or from the manufacturing side is never going to be enough.
It's an ecosystem.
Right? It's an ecosystem. So we were building our ecosystem knowledge, so to speak. And to this day, we still do. So that on top of the fact that there was like 2 other companies in the world doing it. So it's like, it was a wide open space. There wasn't a big push. There wasn't any competition really. But yeah, I'm not sure. I guess that would be the most difficult part is those first years. I think the biggest thing for us was just the fact that I'm not Japanese. And I was like 25.
Was that a kind of challenge for you to get an investor to get some, I don't know, VC funding to back you up and be like, we're going to support this young foreigner who's not established in Japan who doesn't speak Japanese fluently, and we're going to give him a lot of money to build infrastructure in Japan.
Well, I mean, shout out to our investors. One, our investors are fantastic. But two, don't get me wrong. I mean, we operated 2.5 years without investment capital at all. I mean, there was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears and like hungry evenings, before we got that investment. But no, I think for us, it was about showing the vision, showing, really what we wanted to do in this space. I think because I can say like, oh, this was a disadvantage, but as I've learned now in this journey is everything I was insecure about actually became my biggest strength in this space, ironically, right? So I can't speak Japanese, I'm not Japanese, I don't have the connections, I'm not a 30-year aviation person, blah, 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 blah. When we got the investment from our first like venture capital firm, they're like, we're investing in you because you don't have the Japanese mindset, right? You understand the Japanese market because you live here and you've worked here for 3 years in this space. You understand what you have to do here, but depending on the situation, you can adjust and you can adapt and you can bring in a fresh approach that is sorely lacking in this space, right? I think the biggest time where that whole non-Japanese young was in the beginning, getting bank accounts, trying to get partners that weren't up to date in this space. I'm like, look guys, flying cars are coming. They're like, the white dude, 25-year-old white dude is trying to sell us on flying cars and why we should work with him, right? So that was the hardest point, but slowly but surely, again, because there's a huge push from the government, I didn't have to do, the convincing that long, right? It eventually started to just snowball, I would say.
So the government supported the idea, and luckily for you, even designated Osaka as a test city for Japan. So you were right in the middle. Yeah. And that also then opened doors to investors to consider we need to kind of get into this industry if we want to get this going. And you showed them, this is how we can do it. Once you kind of got through with this investment, again, back to you have to now build infrastructure, and your background is into maybe operating the drones and kind of understanding the ecosystem, but you haven't actually built one before. So how do you then find people that are willing to kind of come and work with you on this project to help you actually design the space you want to build? And because if you want to sell those airports or vertiports to potential buyers, you need to have people that can build them, right?
Right, essentially. Well, the benefit is you have time on your hands, right? So this is the biggest challenge and the biggest benefit of where the industry is at right now is it's still going to take time. Turns out takes a really long time to get a new experimental aircraft certified safely to sell and to operate, right? So I don't need people who can build these from day one. I do need people that can help me make connections, that can help me establish business strategy, who can help us formulate the plan of how we get there. But we don't need people to build them from day one. And in terms of a lean startup perspective, we don't even have to build them. I just have to partner with the construction company and advise them on how we want it built, right? And then they build it. So there's always a lot of different ways you can approach stuff. But really, I think, your job as a founder is really simple. It's find the people and inspire the people. Plain and simple. That is your job as a founder. If you can't, find the correct people you need, and again, I'm still, learning as I go. I've had, people that have been fantastic successes for the company that have just been absolute home runs, super lucky, managed to get them involved. And then I've had people that just haven't worked out at all, right? But your job is that simple. It's about finding the people and then giving them a vision or an idea or something that they can then get behind and say, I want to commit to this. This is what I'm excited. This is why I want to come to work. We're doing something that I'm inspired by. And I guess from one way or another, I seem to be semi-decent at that ability. So that's really what I do is I find the people and then lay out how we go there. But again, we're still a small team. We're about 7 or 8 people, I would say right now. Because again, the industry, it's still 1.5 years, 2 years off. Everything's looking at Osaka Expo and beyond. No one's going to be buying the infrastructure until there's aircraft flying. And it doesn't look like the aircraft are going to be flying until end of 2025, right? So we've got time.
So isn't it a little bit the chicken and the egg right now? Because you have You have
Yes,
those
so
aircrafts that need to fly, that need to be tested, and especially probably need to be tested in the environment where they're going to be performing, right?
Yes.
And so
Yes.
if we are thinking air taxis, my first thought is like, okay, it can easily maybe take you from downtown to the airport or something like that.
Yeah.
But you said earlier that in Japan, there are these DID, these zones that are like urban zones, densely populated areas where you're not allowed to fly drones. Yet the Japanese government is kind of pushing for the development of these flying cars. What is happening in this kind of industry right now to what's going to happen first? What needs to happen first? The change in legislation, the infrastructure being built, or the aircraft being approved?
So it all has to happen simultaneously. So I always joke that for my next startup, I'm choosing something that is so independent of other factors that I don't have to worry. Because at the end of the day, that's my biggest stress, is that no matter how successful my group is, if the regulators don't get it right, if the public don't accept it, if the business models for the operators don't make sense, like the airlines, then we don't have an industry, right?
That's a lot of ifs, though.
There's a lot of ifs. There's a lot of ifs, without a doubt.
Personal level, how do you manage all this uncertainty?
Yeah, you just focus on what you can do. And I like to focus on real stuff. So like, for example, I mentioned the public has to accept it. You know, we have built a brand here that like, we focus very much in reality. Like, and it seems, you're talking about air taxis, how reality is that, you know, there's huge reality in that. And I guess just my experience with the drone side of things and starting off in that is like, we don't push the whole air taxi, you're gonna fix urban congestion. We're basically saying, hey, look, last 20 years in aviation has been nuts. There's been so much development that has use cases from everything from emergency and disaster response, medical, agricultural logistics, sightseeing, conservation, security, defense. There's massive aviation innovation in the last 20 years. What if we could capture all of that innovation and value, embed it into one piece of infrastructure, and then make that as accessible to the community as possible, right? That's our whole pitch, which sounds rather realistic. We're not telling you that, hey, we're going to come in and we're going to solve traffic, right? We're basically saying we want to create infrastructure that allows you to access the value that aviation has developed over the last couple of years.
So if you're trying to convince someone who doesn't know anything about this industry, whether it's just the drones or even the eVTOLs, what kind of concrete examples can you give to them and be like, okay, this is what we can actually do tomorrow if the legislation allows us?
Well, there's a lot of examples going on. I mean, again, aviation is huge, right? The one thing people say, well, how's it going to work out? There's a lot of money and a lot of manpower and a lot of smart people working in this field. Everyone in this field, right? Everyone from NASA to like, you've got governments, you've got, heavy research academics, you've got NASA, you've got EASA, you've got, the Space Federation in Japan, everything down from corporates to startups to financing. I mean, there is tremendous unison, which is very not common, I think, with new industries, to make this happen. But when you look at what you can do right now, I mean, you are like, I point to a couple companies. One company which inspired me to get involved in drones was a company called Zipline, right? If you've never heard of Zipline, Zipline is absolutely fantastic, just truly showcasing the whole drones for good mantra. The short story of Zipline was, I think they launched in Kenya. I'm not sure. It might be Kenya. I apologize for my poor geography skills. But essentially in these remote villages, these remote African villages, there is this crazy fatality rate or mortality rate of women in birth, right? And it was some like, and again, please don't quote me on the numbers. I will say something crazy, like 70 to 80% of women were dying in childbirth, right? So they
in very rural areas.
Very, very rural, essentially being that if you start bleeding out and you're in the middle of the bush, like, may God be with you. There's a lot, you got a lot of luck going into that. So they basically were saying, hey, let's build a drone that we can basically shoot it off a slingshot. A doctor will press an app at a clinic somewhere within an area. We'll shoot a drone off a slingshot. It'll fly to the clinic in a straight shot and it'll drop a parachute of whatever they need. Blood, platelets, sterilization, whatever. But they keep all the medical supplies centrally located at a cooled, safe facility, and then on demand, and watch the videos of it. It's really cool. They shoot
Slingshot.
They slingshot. Oh, it's super
Hence
cool.
the name Zipline.
Zipline, hence, exactly. Zipline started, and Zipline has been a massive hit. Not only is it doing tremendous social good, but it's profitable. They're making money, which is like, this is where the industry meets reality, where it's like, oh, we're going to deliver whatever. Like, there's a reason you don't have Amazon drone deliveries going to your house right now. They've been trying for 9 years. There's no money in the coffees, right? However, this person dying, needing like blood platelets and sterilization, there's tremendous need, and there's money behind it. So they were the first company that really was like, okay, not only can you do social good, but you can also make money at the same time, right? So you've built off of that. That's one example. You look at a group called Blade. Blade is basically helicopter taxis. They started in New York, and again, their initial market very similar to Tesla. Really high-end, affluent individuals. They're like, okay, well, you can sit in a 2.5-hour taxi for $115, or you can spend $130 for a 15-minute helicopter ride, right, in New York. Yeah, people will pay for it. So that was, while it started off being profitable, it's like, okay, well, what's the social good here? Well, fast forward now to 2023, we work really closely with Blade India, which is the only other major market they
expanded.
They expanded to India. I think that's the only market they've expanded to. So India is this really interesting this kind of, sandbox where, contrary to the US, which has a rapidly shrinking middle class, India's middle class is exploding. You've got families and lineages that for the first time ever can fly, can take a plane, can do something, right? Do something with an aviation. So Blade India launched there, and I was there. I got to speak to the Ministry of Aviation earlier this year, got to meet their team, meet the Blade India team. And, they were saying, what do you think is the most popular type of air or helicopter taxi in India? What do you think the reasoning behind it is?
Why they use it? Well, if I think of India, I think of very congested traffic with motorbikes and tuk-tuks and taxis, and like in New Delhi, Mumbai, and you just go from skyscraper to skyscraper to skip the traffic.
Right? You think that. Religious pilgrimage. Religious pilgrimage is the biggest use cases. You have your grandmother who her entire life has wanted to make this pilgrimage, but it's a 9-hour hike through the jungle, right? You take a bus, but then you got to hike up to the pilgrimage site, right? Very unrealistic, but it is a deeply, there's a human desire there, and whether you're practicing Buddhism or Hinduism, whatever it might be, they want to take these pilgrimages. So the Air India or the Blade India team, their price is it's like $40.
That's very affordable compared to the 100 something.
Oh my God. Yeah. It's $40. So there's benefits of being in that market there. They can get that price that low. But it's now enabled these blossoming middle class families where your grandmother, before however much time she might have left, she can now make this pilgrimage, which is like a massive, not to say bucket list thing, but like a need for them in that culture, right? So you're starting, it's a slow roll, but you're really starting to see some, we've passed the hype cycle, and now we're on the incline of whatever they describe it as, right?
So you have Zipline saving lives in Africa, and you have Blade India that
enriching lives.
Enriching lives.
Say that. Ankit, you owe me for that one, for sure.
And then what would be an application here in Japan?
Oh, disaster response. Disaster response, medical response. Asia Pacific is projected to be the hub of air mobility in 30 years. If you look at where does air mobility, so the industry I'm in is UAM, which is urban air mobility, but that's like kind of on a regional level. We just say AAM, so advanced air mobility. And this is everything from drone logistics to flying air taxi eVTOLs, right? It's all AAM. Where does AAM thrive the most? It thrives in hard to reach locations, poor access, with an amount of people living there that have to be serviced, right?
So like mountain areas?
Mountains and islands.
Which is Japan.
Which is Japan. It's also Asia Pacific. Is nothing but mountains and islands, right? So there's huge applications here. Disaster relief is big. Logistics is big. Travel is big. Conservation is really, really big as well. I know groups that are looking at, they have to do like regular scans with a plane, right? I mean, if the benefit of these eVTOLs is once they launch, their maintenance costs are projected to be like a fraction of a traditional aircraft's cost. So tons of applications I think we're looking at. But I also talk about, like, compared to, let's say, like the US, for example, like the city to city commuter conscious in a country like Japan is so much more imprinted than the US. Like, if I'm in the US, I might be driving within my city, but very rarely are people driving to different cities for work. It's not to say that it doesn't happen, but it's less common. In Japan, people wake up and go from Kyoto to Kobe every day, from Kobe to Shiga, Osaka to Nara, right? That city to city commuter conscious is so strong and present here, and that's where the aircraft thrive, is that like 60 kilometer range is where they have, huge use. It's obviously expanding more, and there's, even more unique situations for less, but the commuter conscious, the use cases, the demographics, the geography, the topography, Asia Pacific is a prime market for that, which we discovered after we set up shop here. So again, going back to a little bit of luck in the situation.
So now with your company kind of being or establishing itself as the company to contact or to work with in Japan to build this infrastructure, what will be your focus where you're like, okay, this should be the priority for the next few years in terms of infrastructure, because it might lead to the highest return or it might have the highest usability? For example, would it be realistic to say, okay, we're going to build the actual vertiports for these air taxis in the next 2 years and see them flying around Osaka? Or is it more something that we can expect in the next 5 to 10 years?
Very much the 5 to 10 years thing. So again, going back to the chicken and egg problem. Now, it's very hard to sell someone a piece of infrastructure when they can't see the thing to use the infrastructure flying right now.
Yes.
Right. So for us, the future is, my goal is, I describe it as like, we're not at the starting line yet. Like, everyone's putting on their cleats and they're getting ready, but we're not at the starting line. And a lot of groups won't make it to that starting line. The goal for us is that by the time we reach that starting line, we want to look back and see nothing but a solid track record of small, consistent, real steps that have us prepared to execute when the industry starts. So a lot of that is building credibility. It's making sure you have the knowledge base and the expertise and the professional and the network of partners together. The financing side, I mean, there's tons of stuff you have to get ready. I guess, for immediate focus, what we were talking before, we just announced our first flagship facility here in Japan.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. So this is going to be, it's basically going to be a tiny airport, but essentially we've got a massive location that we've partnered with and we've signed the contract on to develop the first vertiport in Japan. It's not going to be just a vertiport. We're looking to have a aircraft hangar. We're looking to have an airstrip. We want to have a vertiport. We want to have a showroom there. Essentially saying that up until the starting line, when the industry begins, there's so many other needs in the industry, right? What if we can build a location where we can allow the industry, the regulators, and the public to come together and engage and create innovation to kind of accelerate the growth of the industry?
So kind of try to break the chicken and egg problem and be like, okay, let's just start here.
Well, you got to get something real. At the end of the day, I mean, and
someone has to make the first step.
LinkedIn in this space is crazy, man. And you got, guy in basement in South Africa and guy in, condo in Mongolia. They're going to capture the Mexican market together. I mean, you've got like absolute craziness. It's like the very wild west right now, but you need something real. So for us, that was a big focus of this year, is like, we need somewhere we can start, and it has to be profitable. But on top of the profitability, we need a place that we can bring the public in and show them, hey, this is going to have value for your community. Because at the end of the day, if you're, especially in a country like Japan, if you're just pushing like, I'm going to have a flying car parking lot in the middle of your city, it's going to be noisy, loud, and big, and you're going to like it. It's never going to happen. Like, again, when you go into like the argument or the idea of like, we're going to fix commuter traffic. It's like, Japan's got the best train network in the world.
Good point.
Right? Like, how do you sell that in this country? But the moment you switch that conversation away and you say, hey, we're going to help create more accessibility in your communities. We're going to help you respond to disasters. We're going to help with medical logistics. We're going to help with, community resilience, all these other things that the industry as a whole can do, not necessarily the air taxis. Suddenly they're like, oh, okay, this has a little bit more value. So for us, it's getting a location. Again, if we can make it profitable, great, because then we're ahead of a lot of other competition because no one's making money at current. So get a space that's profitable and have that space be able to be used in a way that we can bring in as much of the public as possible and educate them, because we really want to lead the charge in showing people the value that this industry has. And we think that's slowly what we've been building towards, and we're having some success recently, it seems.
So you shared a lot until now about the potential value of the industry for the future of basically our communities in Japan and in the world. On your last point, you mentioned you want to bring in the people to kind of show them that value. So how do you have a plan already on how you plan to attract people to come to your basically mini airport? And
so we've got a couple. We can't give out all the secret sauce right now, but essentially it's a mix of workshops, demonstrations, because again, there's a huge need for training. So we got to get people in, we got to get them trained, we got to show them. So workshops, demonstrations, showing them the aircraft, but then also we've got a variety of services planned that actually will directly be able to be deployed from our little facility, we'll call it, to the community, whether it's logistics services, medical services, and then we've got some leisure-based services as well, again, as a way to get people in, get them hands-on with the aircraft, show them some of the possibilities and get them excited about it. Thankfully, there's a little bit of craziness in it that I've had the pleasure of seeing tons of these aircraft, and some of them, you see them and you're like, this is the fact that this is even a real thing and flies is incredible. So it's not hard getting people excited, but the difference between seeing it on a PowerPoint and seeing it in front of you is like, it's night and day, right?
Have you been able to fly some of them?
No way. No, they would never let me in one to fly. No, not many people can say they've flown. I'm just talking about showrooms and demonstrations. I've seen them fly because they can all be piloted remotely, of course. But no one's.
So it's not allowed to put anyone in the pilot seat until it's like properly approved.
Exactly. Yeah, you can have special waivers, of course, and they've done demonstrations in Japan with a couple of aircraft where, like, by God, someone was like, "Send me up, coach." Yeah. But typically that's not the norm. Typically they're unpiloted, they're remotely piloted with a controller somewhere.
I've seen some in the news where they were flying some similar kind of air taxis around Dubai.
Yeah.
Are these also remote controlled, or
yep.
is it?
That's the exact same brand that's here in Japan. That's what you're seeing in Japan. That's Volocopter. Big white flying one with a bunch of propellers. It's Volocopter. They're out of Germany. Really, really solid brand. They're everywhere. They're all over. So they were at the Dubai Expo 2020. They're going to do the first flight at the Paris Olympics. That's when the public is going to see this for the first time. Is going to be the Paris Olympics. 2024 is when the first commercial, as they say, the first commercial flight route will start.
So Paris and then Osaka will be kind of the next launch pad, so to say.
Those are the two, we'll say, catalysts for the next 5 years or so, I would say.
Well, thank you very much for sharing a lot of this. This was super interesting.
Of course, man.
I think we could
industry dump on you guys.
We could keep talking a lot about this, but I was wondering, maybe, is there anything specific about your journey building that company or the industry here in Japan that I haven't asked about that you think maybe that would be interesting to still share?
I mean, a couple, I guess, just some finishing points, so to speak, is like people always ask me, because I guess what I've realized now in hindsight is, like, I of course understand there's a level of craziness to this entire venture. I guess that's amplified by people looking at me, because on paper, right, it's like non-Japanese dude, very young, limited portfolio, doesn't speak Japanese, industry doesn't exist, and no money, right? On paper, you're like, this is nuts, right? So people outside looking in, have said, it's very nuts. But a common question I get is, how did you do it? How did you, get this all set up? Or what would you recommend to people, especially people coming to Japan? Because Japan has this desperate need for more entrepreneurs. As we've talked separately about, we need innovation, we need entrepreneurs here. You need foreign entrepreneurs just as much. A lot of immigrants are really good at pushing societies forward.
Just like here, Zen Group, also founded by foreign entrepreneurs.
Exactly, immigrants. I feel weird calling myself an immigrant, but at the end of the day, but it's network. I tell people all the time, if I could go back, the one thing that made the biggest difference was investing in your network. Right. And in Japan and in any country where you're not, from that country, you need a support network, even for your own mental health. Having like solid people in your network is so critical. Even more so for business. Right. So for me, like what that looked like is when I came here, I just messaged everyone I could find on LinkedIn that spoke English and lived in Japan. And wasn't like trying to do business with them, but it was like genuinely just like, I would love to know what you do here, right? Do you have 20 minutes to chat online, right? And out of that, like, maybe 60% of people were like, I had a 15-minute chat. But the 40% of people, aside from that, like introduced me to some of our first clients or introduced me to the proper connections or future staff of the company, right? So investing in your network pays dividends, but it's not easy, right? I mean, you're gonna have to spend 6 months to a year, putting in consistent work, saying yes to things, I don't really feel like going to whatever, but who knows? Maybe I meet someone. Like, I mean, even like us meeting, like we met at a park, basically. Like we pulled up and Toby's just doing pull-ups at the park. It was interesting. But that event, like I remember being super tired that day, and here we are years later on Fish and Rice, right?
Yeah.
So
thank you for coming. Would you say Japan is a good country for becoming an entrepreneur?
It's getting there.
It's getting there.
We've the reality is we have such a long way to go. Japan's a wonderful country. I have to make sure I don't fall into like, negative thinking patterns about it here, because everywhere is good and bad no matter where you're at. But startups innately go against modern Japanese business culture. The idea of being very risk tolerant, taking risks, pushing ideas, trying new things, messing up all the time, right? That is so engraved in people's brains here as like the worst case scenario, right? Even from like a corporate level, lots of corporates view startups as competition as opposed to like, we can work with this company and make whatever innovation, right? It's changing though. I mean, the time in the 5 years I've been doing it, it's changed tremendously, but we've still got a long way to go. But
it's quite interesting also, because if you think about it, even those major corporations, at some point they were a startup.
Well, this is the crazy part about Japan. At one point, Honda-san was just a teenager strapping engines on a bicycle, right?
Basically.
And now Honda is everyone knows what Honda is. So it's like, but I guess that's natural, right? I mean, that's like the progression of everything. You have that, spirit, and then you succeed, and then you become, something else. You become a corporation and a large entity, and you lose a little bit about what made you in the beginning. So now you've got that push. I think Japan is rediscovering that push and that need. We're getting there though. The exposure is growing, but it'll take time. But I would say, and that's typical of Japan right now, is we're probably 10 years behind a lot of other countries.
But like you said, getting there.
Getting there, exactly. And there's a need. So if you're interested, come to Osaka. We want more foreigners, more entrepreneurs. You guys can contribute quite a bit, I think.
Thank you again, Asa, founder and CEO of Skyscape, for being here today.
Pleasure, gentlemen.
But before we let you go, Andri actually prepared his usual little trivia.
Okay.
So we have 3 questions coming up.
Oh, God.
To which the answer is a number. Yes. And we have to guess.
Okay, do I have to guess?
We both have to guess.
You and I have to guess?
Yes.
You will have to go first as a guest, as an expert, and then Toby.
Okay, I didn't prepare this. I'm about to embarrass myself.
Don't worry, I don't think I've gotten a single one right so far. So you can only do better than me.
Okay. Yeah. Let's check it out.
Let's start with the history. When was the first patent given to a flying car inventor on a flying car? Or some vehicle that would go on road and try to fly.
On road and try to fly as well?
Like it didn't succeed. It didn't fly.
But it got the patent.
It's got to be 50s or 60s. 1950s or 1960s.
Okay, Toby?
I'll say 1972.
Okay.
1976.
Specific, very specific.
Well, what I found, it was as early as 1910.
Wow. Wow.
So the
okay.
guy basically just strapped some wings on the car and was like, this is going
This is
to
going
work.
to take off, yeah. Well, because before, I guess just the background on that. So this is interesting. A lot of people are like, oh, air mobility is so new. Air mobility after World War II was like crazy. The only difference is now we have the technology to make it happen. But everything I'm doing right now already started in the 50s and 60s and then just like failed completely because we didn't have the technology.
Yeah,
And it's
then
now
was on
starting
hold,
again.
yeah.
The first people tried that right after Wright brothers started flying. They tried like, hey, this car already running on the road. Let's
Strap some wings
Yeah,
on it.
maybe
We're
they'll
ready to go. Yeah.
No physics, no calculations,
Love
just
it.
like
just people
let
jumping
it
off
fly.
hills, man. World was a
We're
better
gonna make
place.
it over the Atlantic. Just
World
wait
was a
for
better
it.
place back then.
They tried.
All right, question number 2.
How many eVTOL, right? Is it the word eVTOL companies are there in the world?
Right now.
Yeah, approximate number. There is no exact number. What I found online is approximate
This
number.
is tough because I hear so many conflicting sources on this because you have everything from like corporations like Rolls-Royce with their approach and Honda with their approach down to like garage level inventor guy. Like
That's a lot of different.
a number someone threw out recently to me was more than 700, which could be absolutely absurd. I would say I know personally there's 40 companies I know personally just about in that range that are making some innovation. So I'm either 40 or 700. That's
okay,
that's-
somewhere.
that's- yeah,
The
so-
answer is between.
Okay, great.
What would be your answer? Pick
Between
one.
that, oh god. Either way, I'm gonna sound like a fool. I'll go high, 700. I'll say there's a ton. 700.
700.
I'll say 240.
Okay, 240 is very.
There are
Yeah.
240.
I
This
knew
is my very
it.
first.
First
I
guess.
knew
My
it.
first on point. Wow.
240. Oh,
240.
that's yeah. I wonder,
Probably
I wonder
maybe
if-
registered.
I wonder if mine is like if they're like patents filed or who knows. We were at this big conference in Municipal. And that
Yeah,
was
the
number
big
they
question
put
is
on the screen,
how are
700.
they counted, right? What qualifies
That's
for
very,
them?
very true. Yeah, very true. 240 though. That's still an impressive amount of new aircraft.
Yeah. And they developed approximately 400 different types of eVTOL.
Wow. So from 240 companies,
Yeah.
400 different eVTOL
So
configurations.
2 each on average. Yeah, pretty good. Getting there. One of them is gonna fly at some point.
Soon.
Okay.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Let's get to Japan. And there is a company relatively big, SkyDrive.
Yes.
And they're probably one of the biggest, maybe
The biggest, 100%,
biggest
yeah.
in Japan. Relatively recently, they had a first public flight of their eVTOL or just flying car, I would say.
Yeah.
When was it? The closer you get,
Ooh,
the better.
which one? Because
I think it was the first
the first one, the SD3
public
model, was
in Toyota City.
Oh, okay, I know exactly. I will say 2019.
How about exact date? So
2019 August.
okay, August 2019. Okay, Toby.
So I can't compete on this, and since I just got one right, I don't want to jinx myself. Well, I'll say 2019 July.
July. Okay.
July.
It's 2020 August.
August.
Oh, 1 year off.
Off by a year.
Yeah.
SkyDrive. Yeah, we know SkyDrive quite well. We've been in their facility. We've talked with them quite a bit. Skyscape, SkyDrive. Everything in this industry is like
In
sky,
sky.
drone, air, something mixed together. So, well, interesting. So it turns out I need to study a little bit more on my exact information. We'll have to
But
check.
you've shared a lot of that information with us today, so that was very interesting and enlightening. And
it.
I think we're gonna have to have you back in a couple of years once your first vertiport is
Please,
built.
maybe,
2025 is the year.
yes, 2025 is our target for when we want to debut the facility.
Maybe we can go there to film.
Yeah, right.
We'll do it on the airstrip. It'll just be
Yeah.
us with, I want sheep there as well. We're gonna make it like a farm. It's gonna be
Do
it's
a
gonna be exciting.
podcast from a flying car.
From
There's
the,
gonna be a lot of stuff.
the future of podcasting.
Future of podcast from a flying car, right?
Yeah.
But guys, thank you so much again for having me out. Fish podcast or Fish and Rice podcast. Loving it. Loving what you guys are doing. If you guys come to Japan, check out Skyscape. We're happy to bring you guys out to our facilities, talk more, and hopefully get another podcast episode going soon with you
Yeah,
guys.
thank you very much. This was Fish and Rice Stories from Japan. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, and see you again next week.
Arigato.